Hello students, welcome to our first installment of The Captain's Dog. I'm going to be starting on page 84. I'm backtracking for some kids, but I wanted to make sure that we kind of all start out in the same area. I wanted to go back after the mutiny is all over, and they have reached the Mandans in North Dakota. So it's going to be on October the 29th, 1804. We are now with the Mandans trying to find a good spot to build our winter fort. There was a prairie fire this morning in which several Mandans were burned to death while they were out hunting buffalo. That's from Lewis's journal, and here's now Seaman's words. When the inferno died down, I followed Juilliard and Talbot out onto the scorched flatland to view the devastation. We found the charred remains of buffalo, wolves, foxes, rabbits, and humans. Gray Squirrel and his wife Running Water, Talbot said, looking down at two bodies. Grass fires move as fast as the wind. They didn't have a chance. Caw, caw, caw. Whitefeather landed on a burnt buffalo skin not far from the bodies. It had been a long time since I had seen him, and I figured he had stopped following us. I was happy he was back. Caw, caw, caw. Juilliard and Talbot continued their conversation and did not give the crow a single glance. I walked over to the buffalo skin, and Whitefeather flew away. Something moved beneath the skin, and I started digging. There was a cry to go along with the movement, which quickly turned into a loud wailing. Juilliard pushed me aside and Talbot flipped the skin over. It was a child making the noise. I'll be, Talbot said. Gray Squirrel's son. When the fire came, they must have rolled him up in the wet skin. There isn't a blister on him. Why didn't they crawl under the skin themselves? Not big enough. Juilliard picked the boy up and carried him back to the Mandan village. November the 3rd, 1804. We have started building our fort. It is located across from the first Mandan village. There were two Mandan villages, one on the east side of the Missouri and one on the west side. A little farther north were three Hidatsa villages situated on the smaller Knife River. The Mandans lived in large earth lodges about 40 feet around. In each village, there were 40 lodges, with at least 10 people living in each lodge. At night, they brought their horses and dogs right into the lodge to sleep alongside them. The men built our fort across from the first Mandan village. The gated wall surrounding the fort was made out of stout trees and stood 18 feet tall. The captains had the swivel gun put on top of the wall in case we were attacked. Inside were 2 rows of small huts for the men to sleep in, a foundry and a plaza to hold council with the Indians, of whom there was a steady flow. The Mandan and Hidatsa villages functioned like the wharves I had grown up on, but instead of using money, transactions were based purely on trade. Each lodge was a store filled with goods. Cheyenne, Arikara, Sioux, Odos, French, and English from Canada. Spaniards and men and women from half a dozen other tribes traveled across the Prairie Sea to trade their wares here. A good horse might cost 3 tan buffalo robes, 100 blue beads, and 20 pounds of corn. The Indian who traded the horse would take what he got and trade it for something he and his family needed. The Mandans were experienced traders. When we first arrived, they offered us a few gifts of meat and corn. But after that, it was all business. Dozens of Mandans showed up at the fort every day with bushels of corn and squash, meat, buffalo robes, furs, and other items. The men would sit down with them in the plaza, and the long process of haggling over prices would begin. It wasn't long before the cold descended and held us in its icy fist. The river froze solid, and our men walked around with buffalo robes wrapped around themselves, the hair sides against their bodies. The Mandans didn't seem to be bothered by the cold. They wore thin moccasins and often spent the night out on the windswept prairie without a fire or a robe to keep them warm. Because of my fur, I was not particularly bothered by the cold. In fact, I preferred the cold to the heat of the summer. When the men were off duty, they huddled around the fires in their huts, trying to keep the chill away, or walked over to the Mandan villages to visit with the women. The captains spent most of their time inside the fort. Captain Lewis worked on his notes for President Jefferson, and Captain Clark refined the maps of where we had been. One day, a Frenchman named Toussaint Charbonneau showed up at the fort and walked in on Captain Lewis unannounced, catching him in the middle of working on his animal collection. Charbonneau did not know better than to disturb the captain when he was working. "My name is Toussaint Charbonneau," he said with a heavy accent. "I would like to be your interpreter." Captain Lewis looked up and glared at the intruder for a full minute without uttering one word. Charbonneau had a bushy, unkempt beard, shoulder-length gray hair, and a unique smell to him that I placed somewhere between a buffalo's and a raccoon's. He took his hat off. The top of his head was as bald as a newborn mouse pup. While the captain continued his silent stare, Charbonneau looked around the hut casually, without the slightest idea that his host was irritated. "We already have an interpreter," Captain Lewis said finally, and looked back down at the skull he had been examining. "You mean Drouillard?" Captain Lewis looked up again as if he were surprised that Charbonneau was still standing there. "That's exactly who I mean." "Ha!" Charbonneau slapped his ample belly. Captain Lewis flushed in anger. He didn't like this loud Frenchman, and he was about to throw him out of the hut when Captain Clark walked in. Captain Lewis took a deep breath to calm himself. "We have a visitor," he said. "This is Toussaint Charbonneau." "I've heard the name," Captain Clark said, putting his hand out. "You live up with the Hidatsas?" "Yes, I do." "He wants to be our interpreter," Captain Lewis said. "But we haven't. I already told Mr. Charbonneau that George Drouillard is our interpreter." He was not impressed. "Perhaps I should start again," Charbonneau offered, finally seeing the captain's annoyance. "By all means," Captain Lewis said. "I didn't mean any offense. I'm sure your man Drouillard is a good man. But does he speak fluent Shoshone?" The captains looked at each other in surprise, not sure they understood. None of us had ever seen a Shoshone Indian, but the captains were depending on the Shoshone tribe to sell us horses when we reached the mountains next summer. Making peace with the Shoshones and trading for their horses would be critical to the success of the expedition. The captains had been talking about the problem just that morning over breakfast. "And I suppose you speak fluent Shoshone?" Captain Lewis asked. Charbonneau launched into an involved answer, but Captain Lewis didn't understand what he was saying. "Tabot," he called. Tabot stuck his head into the hut. "Can you find out if this man actually speaks the Shoshone language?" Charbonneau and Tabot spoke in French for several minutes. "He does not speak Shoshone," Tabot explained, "but he has 2 Shoshone wives living with him up at the Hidatsa village. The women were captured in a Hidatsa raid a few years ago, and Charbonneau here won them in a bet with the warriors who owned them. He says he'll bring them with him. He also says he's a skilled boatman." The captains asked Tabot to take Charbonneau outside. "What do you think?" Captain Lewis asked. "We need someone who can speak Shoshone. I don't suppose he'll allow one of his wives to come along without him." "Probably not. And even if he were willing, having an unescorted woman along could pose a problem." Captain Clark nodded in agreement. "We could use another boatman." "True." The captains talked for quite some time before calling Charbonneau back in. After another long discussion, they reached an agreement with him. Charbonneau would be hired, and he would bring one of his wives with him. The following week, he brought his 2 wives to the fort. They were just girls, no more than 15 or 16 years old. When they were introduced to the captains, they stared down at the ground shyly. Charbonneau had chosen the girl named Sacagawea to accompany us in the spring. In the Hidatsa language, he said, Sacagawea means bird woman. The name fit her well. She was a small-boned girl with long crow-colored hair, pulled back and braided in the Indian way. I walked up to her, and she immediately scratched my ears. As I stood there enjoying her attention, I picked up an odd scent from her that could mean only one thing. Bird woman was carrying a pup inside her. The captains were clearly unaware of this, and I suspected Charbonneau was no less ignorant. They would all find out soon enough. When they left, Captain Lewis said, "I hope Sacagawea is strong enough to endure the rigors of our journey. Bird woman would surprise us all." I'm going to take a little break right here.